Okay, thank you very much, my technical advisor there. So I'm going to give you an overview of what we've been up to in Work Package 1. So Rob is my co-lead from Takeda, Pal is the operational lead who works at NICE, and I want to say a big hands up for Mike Chambers as well, who was the previous co-lead based at GSK. So we've been working really hard in Work Package 1, and I think we've produced some great results. We've got a little way to go yet, but we're going to talk you through a little bit of what we've done, and then showcase the framework at the end to give you a little sneak preview of where we're going with all this. I very helpfully stood in for Wim and then used all my slides that I was going to use this morning. So we've had a quick reshuffle. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit, again, I gave you an introduction to effectiveness and what we were trying to achieve with Get Real, and just the very fact that it for a long time has very much been seen as the fourth hurdle, and we've had a lot of, what's the right word to use for this, unhappiness at the very existence of HTA and payer organisations. Got the data, we've proven efficacy, we've got quality, we've demonstrated safety, and then what do you mean suddenly we've got to show effectiveness? So I hope as a consortium we've convinced you about how we look at effectiveness can be changed. And I was particularly struck, I think, Lucian's presentation about efficacy being a subset of effectiveness and how we can think about it differently in terms of modifiers. I mean, that really struck home to me that we actually, maybe we need a mindset. So rather than a stage approach, we need to approach the whole thing differently. Again, I talked about this this morning, which is great. And again, I'd just say from a policy perspective, we are still, I think, we're probably halfway between that first and second ladder on how we see evidence and what we accept. We've still got, I think the regulators are on the bottom rung still, whereas some of the other agencies are further up the ladder. And we really differ as a community in the HTA community and payer community about where we are. And how we look at effectiveness, how we model it, what paradigms we use to evaluate effectiveness. And again, the payer community, I think what's happening in the US when we're starting to see a lot of focus on value, we're starting to see a new set of methodologies come in, which is very much taking budget impact into account. So I think we're going to see this paradigm change again. So I'm just going to talk you through from a policy perspective. I think NICE and Zin and HAS, again, to some extent, we vary in where we are on that effectiveness to efficacy to effectiveness axis. This is NICE's guide to methods of technology appraisal. This is all we say about real-world evidence, and we call it non-randomised and non-controlled evidence in this document. It's 2013. It's going to be updated this year. On the back of Get Real, we're in the process of thinking as an institute about what we mean by evidence. We're having a bit of a rethink. We've got social care, public health, clinical guidelines, medical technologies, interventional procedures. We use different forms of evidence across those programs. We refer to it in different ways. So I'm leading on a piece of work to actually take a step back and have a rethink about what we think about evidence and put a bit more explicit language around it. Because all this basically says is that it's difficult, confounding, biases, blinding, and we're going to be more circumspect about the inferences that are drawn from this type of data. So again, I just alluded to it this morning. We use real-world data a lot. We have been using it a lot. Number of ways we're using it. We're saying we're starting to get this granularity and being a bit more specific. The one we've been talking a lot about today is looking at the effectiveness of interventions, which is where we start to get some of the trickiness around interpreting and using the data. But we've also used it a lot in the modelling activities to provide epidemiological type information, prevalence, incidence, natural history, comorbidities, so that informs the background to the pieces of work we're doing and also the modelling activities. Really important to understand what current practice is. We have very little information in that available to us. You know, it's literally we go to questionnaires to different trusts, different centres to actually find out what is standard care, and invariably we find there isn't standard care. There is variation in practice despite having a plethora of guidelines, which I don't know what that says, but there you go. And resource use, again, if we need to understand and develop the modelling, we need to understand resources. We can audit implementation of guidance, and we can also evaluate interventional studies to evaluate the impact of guidance. So enormous potential for real-world evidence. And we've been doing, again, a piece of work. We convened what we call the Real World Data Steering Group at NICE. And we've been doing a sort of sorting exercise to look at the different data types that are available, both starting in the UK through the government-led initiative, starting with the data that's been made available through Health and Social Care Information Centre, broadening it out. We've got different disease registers, and actually using this as a framework to actually start to understand what those different data sources could be used with. As I say, in Get Real, we're very much looking at the effectiveness around there and evaluating which data sources could be used to demonstrate effectiveness, because we need the right parameters in there, we need the confounders, we need the outcome measures. So it's how those data sets are constructed. And again, these next few slides are just to show you that we are actually doing this as we go through. So recent NICE appraisals, it's not that recently, slides need updating, but just to show you that this data is being used live. So we're not just relying on RCTs, which I think is the presumption. And again, clinical efficacy, we've been using the data to modelling. This has been either submitted by companies in their modelling activities, or we've actually got the academics, the what call TAR teams, which are cited around the UK and elsewhere, to actually use that data. So it is being used. It's a live issue for us. Different parameters. So we've got registry data for aortic aneurysms, data to extrapolate beyond the duration of the trials. And the last one, just that correcting for response rates. So it's used a lot. What we've not been done is been very systematic about how it's used. It tends to be ad hoc, whatever we get in, whatever we can access. So we need to be much more systematic and produced a set of best practices, not only for our internal teams and the academics, but also to inform industry around what they can submit and not submit, and what will actually happen to that data once we've got it. You've heard all about the other work packages, so we've had really interesting presentations about showcasing what we've done. We're now going to focus on work package 1. We were asked to develop a framework to pull all this together and develop policies, and we've done that in a number of ways. One of the biggest difficulties we've got when working in this area, everybody knows it. First thing you start, well, what do you mean by real world data? What do you mean by real world evidence? How are they different? What is big data? So Wim and Amma, who's been working with Wim, has developed a pan Get Real glossary, which has been great. So we started to get some standardization in terminology. That's been out for consultation. Many people have commented on it, which is great. So that's going to appear in our final set of products. Again, Zin has been leading on this. We've had interviews to look at the perspectives of policies of different stakeholders. So we've looked at the softer kind of, what do you think about real world data? What is your thoughts on it? Is it used? Is it not used? They're very soft things and non-evidentiary. And then they've looked at the different policies that the different organisations put out, the formal policies. So NICE's one, for example, was an example of that. But we've looked at the different agencies, including the regulators, to see what they say about real world data, so we can start seeing where the areas of cohesion and difference are. We're going to talk later about the framework, and then Rob's going to touch on the case studies that we did. So again, we did based ours on case studies, and we called them sort of 360-degree reviews. And basically what we were trying to do is we took some drugs or disease areas that were very difficult to demonstrate effectiveness. Companies had lots of challenges with designing development pathways. They had lots of challenges when they hit the agencies with actually getting demonstrated effectiveness. And we looked to see if we could redesign some of those development pathways and add in real world data to see if it would make an impact, and then testing that out with our stakeholders. So we've been busy. The framework, so Pal's going to talk about, so I'm going to leave that. The idea is actually because we want to develop policy development. So again, it's got three faces, this. It's got the companies themselves, it's got the regulatory agencies, and it's also got the sort of HTA stroke payer community. So we need to get a cohesive set of principles so everybody hopefully maybe in the future we'll start seeing the data as a spectrum, see where they lie, so they're not asking for conflicting things. And of course, just my final slide, there's been a lot of softer deliverables that have happened across Get Real, but also Work Package 1, that they were not written into the research protocol, but they've been nonetheless really, really important. Don't think we should lose sight of the fact of this is one of the importance of these public-private partnerships, that we now have a shared understanding of where we are. So rather than being at different sides of a fence, we've now actually got that shared understanding, and it's seen as a technical issue rather than a political issue, which is always great. We now know a lot more about these 5 different disease areas, and again, the different perspectives we all hold on them, and actually how challenged they are. And again, the thing that always, just at my experience with working at NICE for many, many years, is it's this lack of transparency about why we got to a particular decision, or why we got to a particular company decided a particular development strategy, because we don't get the explanations about why one study design was chosen over another, or why comparators. So I think we've now got better clarity with those 5 disease areas. We've got novel method solutions, you've showcased some already. We've got best practice recommendations coming out of this. And I think really importantly, we've got a future research agenda. There's going to be some discussions over the next few months about where we take this, because more methods research is needed, more methods development. And I think we've got an awful lot of collaboration and trust out of this, which as a community we can build on. And that really is invaluable to move forward. So I'll stop there. I'm going to hand over to Rob next, who will walk you through the case studies and other bits.
Thanks, Sarah. Actually, I'm not going to talk about the case studies in any detail. The topic that I've been asked to talk on is acceptability of evidence. But before I move on to that topic, I'd like to make a plea to everyone here. We've got about 70 people here from a range of different organisations, and we're here to tell you about Get Real, and we're all passionate about Get Real. We've worked on it for a long time, and we want to see the outputs from Get Real taken up, and we need you to help us with that. The success of Get Real is going to be, it could be measured in the extent to which the approaches, the tools and everything is taken up. So as you listen to us today, and when you go back to your organisations, please consider how you can take this information back into your own organisation. So if you're a company, a pharmaceutical company, as you consider your research question, as Bruce reminded us earlier, as you think about developing your clinical and real-world evidence strategies, please refer back to what we've done here and think about how you can incorporate it. It's all too easy, as we all know, when we go back to the day job, to go back to doing things the way we have in the past. And there's a huge amount of valuable information and suggestions that could make a difference to your planning in the future if you use it. So please do think about how you could adopt this. Okay, so acceptability of real-world evidence. As Chris said at the outset, one of the things that those who were involved in the establishment of Get Real considered as they were thinking about different questions that were unanswered, about different evidence research design options. One of the questions was, what about the acceptability of these of this information we said that we're going to produce, and these approaches we're going to produce. And now as we get to towards the end of Get Real, as I said, the success of Get Real is going to be in how much we can take these up. And companies will only use these approaches if they're confident that decision makers will accept the evidence that's being produced. So I want to touch on that aspect of the use of evidence in decision making, and specifically the acceptability of evidence. And we know that acceptability of evidence is it has a weight that bears on the decision making, and we know that there are ways of thinking about this in advance. So I suppose the topic here should be likely acceptability of evidence in decision making. And what we wanted to do in Get Real was to consider how the different groups, the different stakeholders, the different players could think about this and plan for it in advance, thinking about the acceptability of evidence and the credibility of the data and the methods. And one of the things that we were able to explore in Work Package 1, alongside the case studies, was this issue of acceptability, specifically to the methods that some of the teams have been working on. And I should say the purpose of doing this was not to come up with some definitive statements on whether or not such and such an approach or such and such a method is acceptable or not. But it was more to highlight some of the issues around acceptability, and, as Sarah said at the end, to provide an opportunity for people from very different backgrounds, different groups, to come together and to discuss these. This really was part of the, I suppose, the broader agenda of IMI Get Real, to provide a forum for discussion amongst different groups, to share views and learnings together. And we hope that you will be able to take that in the future as well. So just briefly on the 2 or 3 points from this slide, really. First of all, let me just remind you that the focus of what we're trying to do here in Get Real, and specifically in Work Package 1, is to provide evidence of relative effectiveness, and specifically to try to think of ways of generating evidence of relative effectiveness prior to launch. And how we've done it has been both at a study level and at a program level. So thinking of the, if you like, the aggregation of a number of different approaches that could be used to generate evidence. And through the case studies, we were able to explore the views of a number of different stakeholders. So decision makers, for example, such as some of the HTA bodies and the regulators, some of the suppliers of evidence, such as pharmaceutical companies and other stakeholders. So we were able to get information from a number of these groups. And then we were able to think about this in terms of alternative evidence development approaches, and not just studies. You'll see that quite a lot of this work's been on specific methods or specific studies, and the case studies were about specific methods, for example. But it was just as instructive to get input on alternative evidence development programs. And Pal's going to talk to you a little bit about this in a moment when he introduces the framework, because the idea of the framework is that it encourages you to think about the totality of the different approaches and not to consider things in isolation. I think the other thing is that as you think about the totality of the alternative evidence development programs, think about this as an opportunity within your organisations to discuss evidence strategies rather than evidence plans for a particular type of study. So the case studies that Sarah mentioned, the idea of the case studies really was to highlight a number of different approaches with real-world data. There were a number of, there were 5 we had in the end, and I'll talk a little bit specifically about the acceptability of evidence. There was one in non-small cell lung cancer, which really explored ways of using information on patients in the real world to make the clinical trial populations look more like real world or local populations. In multiple sclerosis and RA, rheumatoid arthritis, we looked at evidence networks. In metastatic melanoma, we looked at different sources of data, in particular social media. And then in COPD, this was the Salford lung study that Iris referred to earlier. We also looked at that, and that was where we were able to look at questions of acceptability or how acceptable the evidence might be. So let me give you a flavour of what we saw. I'll just give you a flavour of this because you will see this in the outputs from Get Real, which are on the website, and specifically, if you go into the framework, it links to each of those. So let me just, I've got a couple of slides here. One is on the questions, this is the first one, and then the second one really is more on the type of views that we got. As I say, we weren't trying to get to definitive views on a specific method. It was more about what are some of the attitudes that people had and how you might think about those as you plan your studies and your feedback from or your dialogue. If you're accompanying feedback from HTA agencies or regulators, or if you're an agency, the questions that you might address. So in terms of this is the Salford Lung study. In terms of the type of questions we asked when should early pragmatic clinical trials be considered, and obviously that was a question about when there's an efficacy, effectiveness gap. Obviously, other issues that came up were if there's a drug that cannot be studied, for example, or if there's a multitude of different treatment approaches. So there were some ideas there on when might it be more useful than others. How strongly would results from pragmatic designs be accepted as evidence? As you can imagine, there were comments around the importance of the external validity and then the issues around internal validity, which we've already had a discussion about. And then how can we maximise the value of PCTs? Again, there were various comments came back there, including I think there was something about can you get the results included in guidelines or recommendations. So that was a number of different types of questions that we asked. And that you could think about as you are doing your own drug development program. And then in terms of some of the answers, here's just some of the comments that we got back. This just gives you a flavour on this is a different study. This is the one we did in multiple sclerosis, for example. The one on the top left, they'd find it useful as long as the addition of real-world evidence into the network meta-analysis doesn't increase decision uncertainty. Another one, again on the left-hand side there, is the need to improve the transparency of the methodology and the user-friendliness of the information. And again, there were other points about ensuring that there's the capabilities within the organisations to assess these. So that gives you a flavour of some of the answers, and it gives you an idea of the way in which, this is one way in which we explored the issue of acceptability of evidence within our work package. As I said, the detail of the comments and the insights you can find in the documents, and that again you'll be able to find those through the framework that Pal's going to show you in a moment. Just to put it in a slightly broader context, remember that this was only one aspect of how in Get Real we've been thinking about addressing the question of likely acceptability of evidence. Obviously, you've heard a lot about some of the publications that are going to come out into the peer-reviewed literature, and that's going to give people more confidence in the approaches and how the approaches fit together if they could see it in the peer-reviewed literature. So I think we've been quite keen to make sure that the work we've done gets out there and is acceptable in that sense. Obviously, what I've just talked about, the second way, is exploring some of these methods and the acceptability of the methods and some of the issues that are involved around the acceptability of the approaches. And then I think the last point about acceptability is that within the framework, you will see these points in terms of giving the context of all these different methods and approaches and tools. You'll see information about acceptability. So with that third point about the framework, I'm going to hand over to Pal, who's actually going to risk a live demonstration and show this to you now.
Thank you, Rob. That was very encouraging. Right, so we've heard a lot about the real-world framework. So essentially, we're looking at the consortium having produced quite a lot of diverse output, really. And we've seen examples of some of that today. There is actually a lot more that has been produced over the last 2.5 years, and there's still quite a lot in the pipeline. So there's a lot of publications, for instance, coming through. But this is just an example of some of the flavours of what was coming out of the project. So we've got methods, we've got work packages that have been working on developing methods for detecting bias, adjusting bias, how to use individual patient-level data or aggregate patient-level or aggregate real-world data in network meta-analyses. We've got quite a lot of tools, pieces of software, checklists, and various things that are quite sort of functional and ready to be applied in practice. We've got various case studies. We've heard about the case studies today of various nature. Various work packages have done their own case studies. Work package 1 has done 5 case studies, as we heard Sarah and Rob talk about. For instance, we looked at drugs going through the regulatory and HTA process. We identified issues, what we call the effectiveness issues, and tried to look at whether we could come up with solutions around overcoming those issues, solutions that include the use of real-world data, synthesis of real-world data, or study types that are more real-world. We then exposed these in workshops to the stakeholders, and really what we wanted to get out of it was the level of acceptability and the level of usefulness that these stakeholders thought these options might have in real practice. And the stakeholders included the regulators, HTA bodies, and also patients, clinicians, and so on. We've got various summaries that have been generated and literature reviews. We've got, as we've seen already, quite exciting original research that's being published in peer-reviewed journals. For instance, on the drivers of effectiveness that we saw this morning, various analytical methods, particularly around network meta-analysis, prediction models, and various pieces of guidance that are going through publication. So essentially, it's quite a lot there, and we've thought long and hard about how we could incorporate this into something meaningful. And in the original description of work for the project, we committed to producing a decision-making framework. And the original idea was to produce a paper version or a PDF version of something, but having thought about it, we thought something that is a bit more applied, something that's a bit more interactive, might be actually of better value. So this is why we went into developing the framework. So the framework is a web tool that I will attempt to show you in a second. We're not quite there yet, so we've done about a third, I would say, of the building of the framework in terms of content. So we're obviously incredibly optimistic, and we think the glass is 1/3 full at this stage. But it's work in progress, and we're on track to delivering the framework in August, September this year. So what is the framework and what is it for? So essentially, it has, in my mind, 2 key functions. So the first one is to educate the user. It's helping people to find more in general about the potential use of real-world evidence and the potential use of evidence synthesis of real-world evidence. And then the second function would be to help users understand what specific study types or analyses can be applied at specific points in time in the development process. And as Rob mentioned, we're looking at applying these in the pre-marketing authorization sort of time frame rather than what is traditionally done with observational data at the moment. Most of it happens after marketing authorization. So that's a good introduction to the framework. So voila. So this is so we've gone through an iterative process with the Get Real consortium, and we've come up with a functional version of the model of the framework now. And I should say massive thanks to Mike Chambers and Heather Steganga, who are both here today, who have been driving this work. So I should say that what you're seeing now is not a fully completed version. It's still work in progress, but I'll show you some of the sort of, don't focus too much on the actual text in there because that's still being developed. The look and the feel of it is quite simple. So this is the landing page at the moment. It has 4 options there on the left and 1 button there on the right. And this is the result of the work that we've been doing, iterative work within the consortium to try and work out what works for us. So I'm quite keen on hearing from you guys now what you think and whether this sort of makes sense to you. Okay, so I'll just take you to some of these functions. So we've got 4 options here. So the bottom 3 are more static, so static pages of information. And the top one is in my mind, the most important one. That's an interactive element where the user is taken through a series of questions and is led through sort of a story that ends up with various real-world evidence options. And it's so important that we included 2 buttons here. So there's one here and there's one here. So these are the same buttons. But just to show you, for instance, what sort of material is in the background material. So we can click here. So this takes you to information on various diverse themes. So one is about effectiveness challenges. The second one is around the evidence development pathways that Rob mentioned. What are the sources of real-world data? There's some background information, a literature review in there, information for people who are perhaps not so familiar with the development stages of drug development, and then some aspects of the decision-making perspectives that we need to think about. So if we look at the effectiveness challenges, just to show you briefly what you might see in there, these are classified into the sort of typical PICO classification: population, intervention, comparator, and outcome. So these sort of guide you around the challenges that you might come across when you're going through both the HTA assessment in particular and also to some extent the regulatory process. We can have a look at issues related to population here, and this is just to show that the various sorts of patient-related effectiveness issues that you might come across. And we have these for the intervention, comparator, and outcome as well. So this is really for people who are not so up to date with what these issues might be, or could be a refresher for someone who is perhaps more familiar with those issues. We can look at sources of real-world data. This just outlines where you might come across real-world data and what the sources are. Registries, health record, databases, and so on and so on. You can click on that and you can get sort of very brief summary information around the source itself, what it is, examples of it. And in my mind, what's really of value here is there's information about why this particular source might be useful and in what sort of circumstances. But perhaps more importantly, it talks about what are the limitations to the application of that particular source. And very important here, what do stakeholders say about the usefulness and acceptability of that particular source. And this information is sourced both from external sources or outside the Get Real consortium, but has in large extent been based on the case studies and workshops and the sort of stakeholder elicitation that we've been doing throughout the project. Okay, so that's the sources. So we've done challenges, pathways. We're quite keen, as Rob says, not to look at real-world data in isolation. We think real-world data has played a part as part of a whole pathway of evidence development. And what we intend to do here is to show sort of examples of where real-world data fits into the standard development pathway, and then show examples of alternative evidence generation pathways where real-world evidence might in the future play a part. But this is still work in development. Background here. So Sarah mentioned glossary. There is also information on policies and perspectives around real-world evidence incorporated into this. Pieces on data governance and how to best use real-world data and what to be aware of. list of important initiatives that you need to be aware of, initiatives that are producing information and guidance on the use of real-world evidence. We're not claiming that GetReal is producing everything they need to know around real-world evidence. So it's important to be able to quickly find those sources. Information about the efficacy-effectiveness gap that we heard about this morning from Lucien. And perhaps just quickly here, decision-making perspectives. We're quite focused traditionally on the perspectives of the key decision-makers. So that's the regulators, HTA bodies, and pharma R&D, but we shouldn't forget the other stakeholders, including the patients. So we highlight that in here, that patients have a role, they have a perspective, and we sort of intertwine their views in there on the use of real-world evidence. So that's the supporting material. I'll take you now quickly through the more interactive part of the website. So that's the Navigator. So the Navigator essentially has two key gateways, I suppose. So the first gateway is going into clarifying the issue. So when I say the issue, we're talking about the effectiveness issue that Sarah mentioned before. So it's really to educate the user around what are the key effectiveness issues, how do you recognize them, and when should you be thinking about those issues. And the second gateway is once you've understood the issues that you might come across, you can then try and start to look for potential options or solutions, if you like, to try and overcome those effectiveness issues. So if we briefly look at this one here, so clarify the issue, this is still in development, but this is very much material that will link into what you heard from Chris Chin earlier this morning. So Work Package 2 is looking at the drivers of effectiveness efficacy gap. And we intend to put in information here from Work Package 2 around that. So essentially it's very much about asking yourself the questions, what sort of questions do you need to be asking yourself around effectiveness and effectiveness issues at what particular stage in the development. Because it's important to start to think about that early on. And then once you can sort of classify those into sort of different development stages and different decision-making perspectives, but this is something that we've still got to develop further. The second option is a bit more developed, so this is around the real-world evidence options. So once you've educated yourself around the issues, you can then start to think about, okay, I have a particular issue, and now I want to see what could I do with real-world evidence to try and help me out with that issue. So essentially, we start by asking the user to select a stage they're at and select a category of the issue. So we've got population, intervention, comparator, and outcome in there. So for instance, so when you click on that, and then you click on something else here, population, it will come up with options of various issues and options to mitigate those issues. And these issues, as you see, are still being populated. We've got some already in there, but where you see option B, option D, these are just placeholders, and they will be filled with further work. So I wanted just to take you through a quick sort of journey. Imagine that you, say, are in mid-development. You've got a respiratory medicine, and your pivotal study has a very sort of narrow inclusion criteria. And you realize, having gone through the first part of the framework, that the pivotal study may not necessarily reflect the patient population that you expect to treat in real practice. So we want to see what can we do to try and address that issue. So we select mid-development, we select population. Okay, so the study population differs from routine practice. And you can click on here and read a bit more about it. There's brief text about why that might be the case. That's just to confirm that I got the right issue here, and then we've got different options here to try and address those issues. So we can click on trials within cohorts or TWICs. So this has an information about that particular study design, trials within cohorts. What is it? Very brief description. Why is it useful? When is it suitable? What are the limitations? and then also what do stakeholders say about it. And this is where things linked into other material and the case studies that we're running. So, for instance, you can click here. So this topic was a subject of a case study in Get Real. So you click on that. And this links to a case study done by Chird and colleagues around the limitations of Twix. So this outlines then what was examined in the case study, what were the key findings, contact details, and then, importantly, links to the full material that has been published, either in a journal or on the Get Real website. So for all the case studies that we're producing in Get Real, we'll create these sort of summaries to try and make the material more accessible to the users. A second example I can show you perhaps is let's imagine that you are late in development and you have a product that is going through an HTA assessment, and you think the studies have been done in a different country, different jurisdiction, and the comparator arms don't necessarily represent the current standard of care in the country that you're intending to submit to. So you can scroll through here and you can find your issue. Study comparators exclude current standard of care. You can read more about it if you want to. And you can click on the option here, which would be to do a network meta-analysis. This is just a brief description then of network meta-analysis. We have these for different evidence synthesis options. Why is this useful? When it is useful? What sort of techniques for evidence synthesis are available? This is very much work in progress, so ignore the sort of structure of this. You can click on different study designs. And this would be, for instance, to use network meta-analysis with IPD, real-world evidence. Again, that outlines why it is useful, when it is useful, limitations, and the stakeholder perspectives around that. So this really summarizes quite a lot of the workshop output that we've been doing and generating, and also incorporates the deliverables that the project as a whole is generating. And again, through links, you can get to the full reports and the full deliverables on the right-hand side here. So that is a very quick whistle-stop tour of this. So essentially, what we've produced here is a framework that we've intended to be a shared platform between all stakeholders around the options and use of real-world evidence. We've tried as much as possible to include the different perspectives of stakeholders in this product, and you see that throughout the pages we include stakeholders' perspective around the usefulness and acceptability. We include evidence generation pathways because it's important to think about real-world evidence not in isolation but part of whole development programs. And this is very much an educational resource and is signposting users to content that has been generated both within the consortium and also external content that's been generated out in the real world, if you like. So I think we would very much like to hear your initial reactions generally about the framework, whether you think this is useful or whether the structure of it makes sense to you, or whether the level of sort of simplicity or complexity is right, and also really about the sort of what you've heard, summarize what we've heard today, what you think about likely acceptability of real-world evidence, having heard what you heard today about the research that's been done within the project, and also what we need to prioritize perhaps in terms of development of methods, methodology, and policy. So have we got any more time, or are we running out of time?
You've got time.
Okay, so if Rob and Sarah, if you'd like to come up and we can take questions and have a discussion around these topics.